Hi guys, today I want to talk about the privatized prison system and why it needs to be abolished. So I just want everyone to pretend that they were born in the year 2001. This isn't far off for me. I was born in 98, so it might not be off for a lot of you guys. But as a white woman, I have the 1 in 111th chance of being incarcerated for my lifetime. If I were to take my race out of the equation, just as a woman, it doubles, almost doubles, to 1 in 56. And you can see that here. I'm using Sour Patch Kids as a visual aid because I feel like just showing an infographic sometimes isn't enough. So if you see things comparatively, sometimes it helps a little bit better. So this is a 1 in 56 chance. Now, if I was a man, it goes up drastically. I would have a 1 in 17 chance of being incarcerated for life. If I were a white man, I would have a 1 in 9 chance of being incarcerated. Now, the population that is the most likely to be incarcerated for their lifetime is Black men. And I want this to sit in your heads for just a second. They have a 1 in 3 chance of being incarcerated for their lives. And I didn't just pull these numbers from anywhere. These came from the U.S. Justice Bureau of Statistics. So just keep that in your head as I'm talking. Now, privatized prisons kind of run on their own agenda. They don't really have to deal with the government standards that have been brought forth, kind of like federal and public prisons. And those are the 3 options that you have if you were to ever be incarcerated. You could either go to a private prison, a public prison, or a federal prison. Now, because they don't have to abide by the same regulations, they put the business of being a private prison first. So they put that over the community that they're supposed to be serving, they put that over the justice system at times, and they definitely put money before people's lives. And how that kind of works and how we kind of got here is due to the prison industrial complex, or the PIC. Now, privatized prisons are one part of the PIC. They're not the reason for it, and vice versa. They are like yin and yang, they need each other. But if we get rid of privatized prisons, it would be like ripping off a Band-Aid, so we can get to the deeper issues. Now, there are 3 components to the prison industrial complex. That is systematic racism, the war on drugs, and mass incarceration. And so I want to start with systematic racism. And I mean, you could start with the transatlantic slave trade. You can even go before that, but today I want to start with December 6, 1865. That was the day the 13th Amendment was ratified. And the 13th Amendment states neither slavery nor servitude, unless slavery or servitude, unless that party is convicted either in the U.S. or where the jurisdiction reaches. It pretty much states that slaves are convicts to the state. And I also want to let that sink in for a second, because that's a big deal. That's the way that's worded. So people that didn't agree that slaves should be free had to think of a way to control them. So what they came up with were the Black Codes, and all the Black Codes were a method to control this freedom in public. So they could charge them for vagrancy, for loitering, for not having a verifiable job as a recently freed slave. And so they would put them into debt peonage. It's also known as debt slavery. And so all that meant is that they would be given essentially to an employer. The employer would give them something up front. It could be products, it could be travel, or it could be money. And then they would have to work it off, kind of like indentured slavery, or indentured servitude, rather. So that has definitely contributed to the prison industrial complex. A century later, President Nixon ran his campaign with the slogan "Law and Order," which conceptually sounds good. A society would want law and order, but in the historical context, they were reacting to the civil rights movement and to the anti-Vietnam sentiments in America at the time. So law and order isn't what you might think it should have meant. That being said, that definitely contributed to the prison industrial complex. And the next thing that makes that up is the war on drugs, which we can also thank the Nixon administration for. He came out with the drug prevention and control laws, which essentially scheduled drugs. It essentially ranked them into 5 schedules, 5 being the worst. And that mainly at that time was because of the Chinese immigrants coming into California with the opium trade. And then it kind of turned into demonizing black men with heroin. And so then it kind of turned into anti-Mexican sentiments with marijuana. And so here we are today. You're like, oh, there's nothing, relating to that today. Growing up, I used to watch cartoons, and in between, I would see the commercial where somebody would crack an egg and it would start frying, and they would go, "This is your brain on drugs." So it's not just something, way back when, it's still within the past, 10, 15 years. And it was complete and utter failure. We still have the same amount of drugs, but same amount of drug use rather, in higher rates of incarceration. So I don't know, nothing's changed. It hasn't really worked out. That being said, the last but not least, mass incarceration is what makes up the PIC. Again, because of Nixon, we got the no-knock rule. And so essentially what that did is it allowed police to enter a premise without knocking, without announcing themselves. And of course, that got repealed. And so now we kind of have that equivalent in the stop and frisk laws, where police can stop people based on reasonable suspicion. And it is good in theory, but again, it does get abused more often than it should. And that definitely contributes to mass incarceration, because it's filling these prisons. The prisons, the people that are in the prisons usually haven't even been to trial yet. They are awaiting their trial. So there's definitely an issue with filling these prisons, let alone with people that haven't even been to trial yet. That being said, everyone kind of views the prison system, it should be viewed as a way of rehabilitation rather than punishment. And a lot of people lose sight of that. And that's kind of how we treat it, as a method of punishment instead of rehabilitation. And so recidivism is essentially the cycle, people, committing crimes and staying in that cycle, people that offend more than one time. And so it's hard to break that cycle when you're looking as a method of punishment instead of rehabilitation. And so that also contributes to mass incarceration, because there's just not the resources that should be there for those inmates in those private prisons. The treatment that they get in those private prisons also just are horrible. There's not been an unbiased study that has been conducted that states it's, been more efficient. The life has been, better there, because they've just been biased studies, essentially. And so the people that profit off of this are actually not just the prisons themselves, but corporations that you want to think of, banks, private, banks make bank off of it, telecommunication companies, oil companies, medicinal companies. They all make a profit off of these people because it's cheap, unregulated labor, and it's not okay. A lot of people, when they argue against abolishing privatized prisons, look at it either from a opinion of racism, or just really not looking into what goes on in there, rather than the profit margins and who's in there, that kind of thing. So if you were to read the book, I read it before I did this speech. It's called Prison Inc. It's free on the library. The analysis is only 24 pages. Highly recommend it, but it goes into the life of a convict. His name is anonymous in the book. And he goes from a state prison to a private prison, and it just talks about his transition going there and all the injustices that go on there, and how untrained the people that work in these prisons are, and how they're just so violent. He described it as it being the most violent prison I would ever be in. So they're just not good for the life of the person that's committed a crime. And again, a lot of those people that have committed crimes haven't even gotten their trials yet. So again, the prison industrial complex does feed into privatized prisons, and that's why they need to be abolished. So